Well, joining us now from up in New York City is Daniel Pipes, who is director of the Middle East Forum. Good morning.
Good morning, Peter.
Thank you for joining us. Wanted to show you the front page of The Economist magazine today. It says, the one thing Bush got right in the Middle East, and they say it's democracy. And they write in The Economist today, Mr. Pipes, that holding elections is not a panacea. Democracy cannot at a stroke heal national conflicts, create civic institutions, or modernize traditional societies. But whatever else people think of Mr. Bush, on this one thing, the universal potential and appeal of the democratic idea, he is on the side of history. What do you think?
I agree in principle. I entirely endorse the American push for democracy. When Mr. Bush first came out with this project in November of 2003, I wrote a column saying, good news, but this is a dangerous course. Let's be very careful about it. So while full-throatedly endorsing it, I have my reservations about the actual application and implementation.
Do you think democracy is compatible with Islam?
I do indeed. I think Islam, like all great religions, is variable in its interpretation, and there is no reason to think that Muslims cannot be democratic, and indeed there are a couple of Muslim democratic states, or let's say a couple of states predominantly Muslim that are democratic.
Let's get into the Hamas victory, which you've written about recently, Daniel Pipes, and you call it democracy's bitter fruit, and you say that now that Hamas has won the Palestinian elections, the West is hoist with its own petard. What do you mean?
What I mean is that there are two conflicting principles that we have. One is the push for democracy that you and I have been talking about, and the other is the abomination of terrorist groups and the desire, the intent to destroy them. Well, what happens when we, by our exertions behind democracy, push for a terrorist group to be legitimized and turned into a political actor, such as just happened some days ago with Hamas?
The Washington Post this weekend writes about democracy's consequences, Daniel Pipes, and I wanted to get your reaction to one passage in this editorial. Perhaps you've seen it. It came out yesterday morning. While the consequences of the Palestinian vote remain highly uncertain, this rush to condemnation is nonsensical. It ignores the collapse of authority in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip before the elections, and it ignores the opportunity democracy created to remedy it. What's your reaction?
Well, there's no doubt that the Palestinian Authority run by Fatah and under the auspices of Yasser Arafat and then Mahmoud Abbas was incompetent, corrupt, a thoroughly nasty authority. And I in no way endorse it. And indeed, it also had aspirations to destroy Israel. All that said, why are we pushing and why are the Israelis allowing for a terrorist group to participate in elections? We have, in other places, like Afghanistan, prohibited terrorist groups from participating in elections, in Iraq, and it is a fairly common practice that illegal organizations of this sort should not be allowed to run for office. So, in other words, we have a principled opposition to Hamas, which we deem a terrorist group legally. You may not raise money for it in this country. You'll go to jail for doing that. And at the same time, abroad, in Gaza and the West Bank, we are the ones who push, who insist that elections take place. And because of the failures of Arafat and Abbas, because of the attractions of the doctrine and activities of Hamas, it wins a substantial victory, a majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council.
Our guest will be with us for 40 minutes. He's up in New York. He is Daniel Pipes, director of the Middle East Forum. Mr. Pipes, what is the Forum?
The Middle East Forum is a think tank that's based in Philadelphia. We engage in the activities that think tanks do. We put out a journal called the Middle East Quarterly. We have various projects like Campus Watch, which looks at the teaching and writing about Middle East studies at the universities. We have public lectures in several cities. We write extensively. We go on television and radio. We look at the Middle East from the point of view of American interests.
You may have also read Mr. Pipes' work. He's a columnist for the New York Sun, the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, and the Jerusalem Post. And here are the numbers to call. We're talking about democracy in the Middle East, and Republicans can call 202-737-0001. Democrats 737-0002 and Independents 202-628-0205. Mr. Pipes, you also wrote recently that the Hamas-led Palestinian Authority must be isolated and rejected at every turn, thereby encouraging Palestinians to see the error of their ways. We've also learned this morning from the AP that Israeli officials have agreed now to transfer about $45 million owed to the Palestinians after delaying this payment last week. What are your thoughts on that move, that decision?
Well, there's been a lot of talk in the last days by the Israelis, the European Union, United States government, and others that payments, that monies will not be going, be it foreign aid or taxes, to a Hamas-led Palestinian Authority. I don't believe that for a second, and I think that the Israeli decision is a precursor of others to come. More broadly, I think that the impetus to hold negotiations is so strong that I have no doubt that a formula will be found whereby Hamas mouths certain words about accepting Israel, and it will then become acceptable. And by the way, this replicates a process that took place some 20 years ago. In the mid-'80s, the U.S. government was in negotiations at some length with Yasser Arafat so that he would pronounce certain words. And finally, in December of 1988, he did. He said, "I renounce terrorism," and then the negotiations began. I expect something similar to happen this time around, but much more quickly.
Before we go to calls, Mr. Pipes, how do you think Iraq's going to perform as a democracy? How do you think it's doing now and in the future?
Well, Iraq, like other states that have had elections recently in the Middle East, has seen a surge in the popularity of a radical Islamic movement. I think given the circumstances under which the Iraqi elections took place and given the background of 30 years of Saddam Hussein's rule, it's not too bad. But it is a pro-Iranian Islamist who is prime minister in Baghdad, and I worry about that. I worry about the fact that practically everywhere that elections take place, be it in Afghanistan or Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Palestinian Authority we've been discussing, Lebanon, Egypt, Algeria, one sees that it is the Islamists, the radical Islamic elements, the ideologues, the totalitarians, the people most opposed to us, who win or who gain because they are the most coherent ideologically, the best organized, the most funded, and the movement with the most dedicated cadres, so that they do well. They are prepared for these elections. And my view is that yes, elections, yes, democracy, but slowly, modestly, and carefully, so that we don't bring totalitarians to power. We don't see a repeat, as it were, of Hitler coming to power in 1933 or Salvador Allende in 1970. We don't want fascist communists or Islamists coming to power and legitimated through the ballot box.
First call for Daniel Pipes, who is up in New York. He's with the Middle East Forum and Atlanta, Georgia. Good morning.
Well, Mr. Pipes, you and I both agree on the facts that, in actuality, Bush is popular in the Middle East for democratizing, yet at the same time, the lunatics seem to win the elections. And the problem is, I see it, is this. As Pappy's done a study, and I'm sure you know Pappy's study, where basically the extremism is driven by the view that we're imperialists trying to, the railing call, whether it's true or false, is that we're trying to steal their oil and we support the repressive governments, and that's the railing call. I don't think anyone can argue with that. So I think a simple solution, I'd like to hear your opinion, if we didn't have dependency on Middle East oil and we really did it, and we used the purchases of Middle East oil to promote democracy, at least, I don't know if we can change Islamic extremism, but at least they'd be going after the leaders and not us. And I'd love to hear your opinion.
I partially agree. I do think it's a great problem that we and much of the world is purchasing Middle East oil. As one analyst has put it, every time you go to the gas station, you're funding the enemy. We are sending money to Saudi Arabia, Iran, Libya, and other states, which are in turn using this money to promote radical Islamic movements, including Hamas, and terrorist movements. So yes, ending our addiction to oil is a very important priority for a whole range of reasons.
Our next call, Lanham, Maryland, for Daniel Pipes. Hello, Lanham.
Good morning, C-SPAN.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir. So I have a question for you. I first have a comment, then a question. I believe that we're not trying to spread democracy across the Middle East. I believe we're over there to get those guys, those countries' oil, and specifically Iraq's oil. I don't think that we care anything about those people over there. I think we care more about those people's resources. I'd like to ask you a question about Israel, sir, because there's quite a few corrupt people within this administration. There's corrupt people in every organization, one or two. And there's corrupt people in Israel. We are too heavy-handed with the Palestinians. We protect Israel like more than we protect our own country. I'd like to know how come it's a fact that Israel can shoot missiles at people, not at buildings and whatnot, but at people, and get away with it.
Daniel Pipes.
Okay, thank you. First, on your comment that the U.S. government is primarily interested in oil, not in democracy. You know, if that were true, then what we would have done years ago was to cut a deal with Saddam Hussein. Think how much money that we, the American taxpayer, have spent on the war, the rebuilding of Iraq. Far more efficient, far more economical would have simply been to cut a deal. He was willing to sell. We could have allowed our oil companies to prospect and to build the oil infrastructure. All of it would have been much cheaper. There's no way that you can see what has happened in recent years as oriented towards getting cheap oil. It's in fact quite expensive oil when you factor in all the money that we have spent. We did this because we're afraid of Saddam Hussein's rule domestically and internationally and what it might lead to. And we took a punch in the chin financially in terms of spending and in terms of now the increase in oil prices. So no, I don't think that's a correct analysis. As for Israel and what you're saying we do, we coddle the Israelis and we sit by as they send missiles against the Palestinians. There have been Israeli missiles from time to time against the Palestinians. To the best of my recollection, we have condemned it. At the present time, the missiles are going the other way. Whether they're going from Gaza to Ashkelon or from Lebanon to northern Israel, it is Palestinians and Lebanese who are directing missiles against Israel. And the Israelis have been remarkably restrained in their response. Just yesterday, a child was severely injured by one of those missiles coming out of Gaza. And it's quite remarkable the extent to which the Israelis are not responding. So on both points, we'll have to disagree.
Mr. Pipes, the Washington Times headline says that from the Gaza Strip, Hamas hopes to take power soon. Fatah silent on militant group's invitation to join government. What do you see happening as a government is formed here?
Well, I'm reluctant to use the word government, as this is not a state. This is an authority. But that said, I do think that Hamas will take power decisively, and in contrast to the sloppy, corrupt, anarchic regimen under Yasser Arafat and then Abbas Mahmoud, we will see a far more disciplined, far more directed, cohesive, purposeful control by Hamas. It will be very strict, and people will be leaving because they won't like it. There will be a rigorous extension of power, and the Israelis will feel it, the Palestinians will feel it. It's going to be quite a shift. After decades and decades of Yasser Arafat's model, we're now seeing something quite different begin.
East Lansing, Michigan, for Daniel Pipes. East Lansing, you there? I think we lost them. Let's try L.A. Go ahead, Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, you there?
Yes, sir. Mr. Pipes, it's a known fact that Israel was
L.A.? Sorry, I think we lost L.A. as well. Let's try Annapolis, Maryland. Are you there?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine. Go ahead.
Okay.
All right.
Isn't there a real credibility issue with the whole concept of the United States promoting democracy when for many, many decades the United States, in fact, did the reverse? Everything from toppling the democratic regime in Iran in the 50s to supporting Saddam Hussein, to supporting the Taliban's rise against the Russians, to even now tacitly maintaining relations with a number of totalitarian states in the area. I mean, the duplicity is really ridiculous, isn't it?
I'm not sure why you call it duplicity. What you see is a change in policy. First, I'd argue with a couple of your facts. The United States did not support Saddam Hussein. We did help the Iraqi government against the Iranian government. When the Iranians were at war and winning against Iraq, we helped beef up the Iraqi side a bit. But in general, over those 30 years that Saddam Hussein was in power, we did not support him. We certainly did not support the Taliban against the Russians. The war in Afghanistan ended in 1989, and the Taliban came to power in 1996, so we didn't support them at all. But nonetheless, I mean, you're making a valid point that we've had a change. As I suggested earlier, President Bush in November 2003, in a dramatic statement, said 60 years of emphasis on stability has ended. We are no longer going to emphasize stability. We are going to work for democratic change. A radical change. 6 decades of policy, bipartisan, Democrat, Republican policy had ended at that point. Now, you can't expect everything overnight to shift, all the relationships to shift, but there has been substantial change. Indeed, more change than I personally would like to see. We've pressured governments across the region to open up, to allow elections to take place and other changes to occur in the direction of political participation. I don't know why it's duplicitous. It's a forthright, outspoken, blunt, overt change of policy. And it has, in fact, taken place. The President has delivered. I have my doubts about the implementation of it. I think it's too fast, too unthinking in its application, but it's definitely taken place, and there's nothing duplicitous about it.
Our guest is educated at Harvard, has worked at the Departments of State and Defense, also the U.S. Institute of Peace. Daniel Pipes is now director of the Middle East Forum, and our next call is from Gloucester, West Virginia. Thanks for hanging on. Hi.
Mr. Pipes, there's just so many contradictions with these claims in regard to spreading democracy. I mean, the U.S. undermined an election in Iran in the 1950s. The situation in Iraq is just certainly, as so many foretold, a quagmire, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis that we don't count, yet we somehow come up with the numbers of how many people Saddam Hussein killed, but yet we can't come up or verify, although Iraqi body count and the Lancet report, and I think it's John Hopkins, verified that over 100,000 Iraqis have died, and Americans just don't seem concerned about how many people we may be killing in this march for supposed democracy. And do you think Israel should sign the very same IAE non-proliferation treaty agreements that they demand that Iraq and Iran and other countries in that vicinity abide by?
Lots of questions, thank you. There is inconsistency, and there is invariably inconsistency in foreign policy. When governments aspire to some kind of consistency over time and in different places, but invariably are inconsistent, given their needs and developments on the ground. So I don't think that saying that U.S. policy is inconsistent is a major indictment. That is commonplace, and it indeed is inevitable. We are at war in the Middle East in the sense that we are fighting terrorism, or as I would put it, radical Islam. We have been fighting in Afghanistan. We've been fighting in Iraq. Our troops are present in a number of other countries. We are trying to defend Americans and American interests. We are also allied with a great number of other countries in doing that, indeed many local countries. We at times have to overlook their foibles, their problems, because we need to cooperate with them. Two specific instances that come to mind are Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, where there's a lot that takes place in those countries that we don't like, a lot that the government does in the case of Saudi Arabia we don't like, but we work with them nonetheless because we need to. As for Israel signing the non-proliferation treaty and other IAEA accords, given Israel's circumstance, given that it's surrounded by enemies, many of which would like to see it eliminated, I think giving them a break and giving them the defensive mechanism of having nuclear weapons is important, has been the case now for decades, has led to stabilizing rather than destabilizing of the region. When you look at Iran, with the messianic, extremist ideological government in place there, it's quite another story.
Daniel Pipes, there was a lot of layers to the Iran story, and let's talk first about its relationship with Iraq and its influence on Iraq as democracy tries to form there. Put those two countries together for a moment, if you could.
Sure. The Iranian government represents a brand of radical Islam, has done so since Khomeini came to power in 1979. And one of its most urgent projects is to expand this kind of Islam to Iraq, in part because Iraq is a neighbor, in part because the two engaged in a 6-year war in the 1980s, and in part because there is a majority population in Iraq that subscribes to the same kind of Shiite Islam as is found very widely in Iran. So the end of the Saddam Hussein rule, with its totalitarian control, has provided the Iranians with great opportunity to find supporters, to do their work, to infiltrate, to gain influence in Iran, and that they have not been reluctant to do. And we are dealing with that in Iraq. This is one of the ways in which I am a little nervous about American involvement in Iraq. I think we're overly involved in the nitty-gritty of daily politics in Iraq. I think we should more treat the Iraqis as adults and say, it's your country, we'll be there to help you in a variety of ways, but ultimately you've got to fix it, you've got to develop it, it's your problem, we're there just as counselors, we're there to make sure nothing terrible takes place. But I would like to see less of a forward role by American soldiers and American aides and consultants in Iraq.
And of course, the latest headlines are the following. Here's the Washington Post: Iran to face Security Council. We learned that at midday yesterday. And then, Mr. Pipes, we've been reading on the AP this morning that Iran is apparently reversing itself now and says it will hold talks now with Moscow on a proposal to enrich Iranian uranium in Russia. Is that a hopeful thing, if that's true?
It could be, but it's more likely a delaying tactic. I think the Iranians are seeking ways cleverly to keep us and the Europeans and others at bay. And so one moment they're talking, one moment they're permitting the seals on their nuclear installations, next moment they're ripping off the seals and ending the talks. But as time goes on, they proceed to get closer and closer towards the ultimate goal of weaponizing the nuclear warheads that they're trying to build.
Do you advocate U.S. military action if it comes to that?
I think that is the ultimate question, not what the United Nations Security Council will do or what the IAEA will do, or for that matter what Israel will do. The ultimate question is, what will the United States government do? Will we destroy certain targeted parts of the Iranian nuclear weapon infrastructure, or will we not? Should it come to that, I'm in favor of that. And I might add that I'm in favor of going in and destroying limited targets. I do not want to see us occupy Iran, fix Iran, rehabilitate Iran, spend money in Iran, change the regime in Iran, none of these things. Just take out specific targets, roughly as the Israelis did in Iraq 25 years ago.
Back to calls for Daniel Pipes, Princeton, New Jersey. Thanks for waiting. Hi there.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Mr. Pipes, I'm just wondering if you think it might better serve us to speak of promoting liberalism in the Middle East rather than democracy. And by liberalism, I mean simply the protection of rights, the freedom of religion, the things we hold dear, essentially the things that the Bill of Rights protects here in America. And I ask this because, as you mentioned earlier, democracy, spreading democracy, only seems to encourage the most radical elements in the Middle East to hold power. Look at, for example, Iran and just recently Hamas. And if you agree that this might be a better way to formulate the debate, I mean, how do we then promote this, and is this at all consistent? I mean, there seems would be a debate within Islam about whether these kinds of reforms could be instituted. I just wonder how, instead of just talking about elections and sort of procedural mechanisms, how we can fight this battle of culture, which seems to be the more lasting and important battle we have to fight. And I'll take my call off the air.
Good, thanks. Very good point. Yes, our ultimate goal is not that elections take place, but that there be a change in the body politic. In the 1980s, it became widely recognized that democracies, by and large, do not fight each other. So in addition to their other virtues, there's a peaceable quality to democracies. And at that time, the National Endowment for Democracy, President Reagan's Westminster speech, and other major developments moved us in the direction of democracy. But as you correctly point out, democracy is procedural. And simply having elections in itself is not that much of a step forward. What is implied by democracy, or should be implied, is a wide range of what are called civic society changes. Civic society means such things as the freedom to develop voluntary associations, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of religious choice, rule by law, property rights, the understanding of a loyal opposition. This is far more massive, and I might add counterintuitive, than simply elections. I mean, we as Americans take for granted these various precepts, but in Iraq, where they've lived for decades under Saddam Hussein's tyranny, these are not natural ideas. And the historical record shows that it takes decades to develop and implement these ideas. If one looks around the world, for example, at ex-Soviet Union, one sees it's 15 years and the clock is running and still it's very shaky. In Mexico, it's been a similar period of time as the system has opened up. Or Chile, or Taiwan, South Korea, Turkey. These are countries that have been moving gradually over a period of decades towards full democracy. You can't just make it happen. So, you're shifting it from the process to the end result, I think, is a wise goal. The problem is in implementing it. How do you call for liberalism? How do you implement it? How do you make this happen? And I think it's because of the difficulty in getting there, in explaining what it is you have in mind specifically, that there has been this emphasis on democracy. The emphasis on democracy is fine so long as we remind ourselves and operate along the basis that this means much more than elections. Or to put it differently, elections are the capstone of a democratic process. First come all these changes about rule of law and the like. And then I would add, elections should be from the bottom up, for dog catcher as it were, and then higher and higher. And additionally, it should be initially in the legislative branch. It should be for Parliament. And then secondly, for the legislative branch. So in other words, we're beginning at the end by starting with elections for the Prime Minister. That should be the very final step in a long series of preliminary efforts to open the system up. If you could come to me with an idea of how to make liberalism the goal, I'd be entirely with you. I just don't know how to do it.
Caller now from River Falls, Wisconsin. You're on with Daniel Pipes. Good morning.
Morning, Mr. Pipes.
Morning.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
I hear you, yes.
Go ahead, sir.
I had two questions. One, was radical Islam and terrorism an issue for us in Iraq before the U.S.-led invasion, or is that a byproduct of our invasion? And B, do you agree with my premise that during the Iran-Iraq war back in the 80s, that we in fact were providing weapons to both sides of that conflict, and that we were backing Saddam Hussein, but yet funneling weapons to Iran because of the hostage situation, that possibly we may have some of the despise, for lack of a better word, of the U.S. over there because of our taking two sides in the same conflict. Thank you.
On your first question about radical Islam in Iraq, well, there were certainly elements of it. Saddam Hussein had connections to radical Islamic groups, but he himself had no particular point of view. He was interested in power, a ruthless dictator who nominally belonged to the Ba'ath Party and subscribed to Ba'ath ideology, but really was someone who ruled and who went for power. In the President's State of the Union speech 4 years ago, in 2002, he described the famous axis of evil being made up of Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. I never cottoned too much to this axis because it seemed to me they're rather different. I mean, they're all problem states, but rather different. And to see them as terroristic would be a mistake. North Korea does not present a terror problem. Iraq under Saddam Hussein did not present a terror problem as such. That wasn't the main issue. And even in Iran, that wasn't the main issue. It was putting together three quite different states in one category. So no, we had all sorts of problems with Saddam Hussein, a virulent, malign leader, but radical Islam was not one of them. It has become one in Iraq since then. As for the Iraq-Iran war and our supporting both sides, I would look at it a bit differently and say, well, you're right that we did provide some intelligence to the Iraqis. We did have the Iran-Contra and offer arms to the Iranians. By and large, we saw both sides as hostile, and both sides were hostile. And our general policy was poxed on both of their houses. We toyed with the idea of encouraging this war to go on just because it deprived each of them of the opportunity to do other things. But in the end, our policy was basically hands-off, with some exceptions, such as the ones you and I noted. And we did not encourage the war to go on. We did not really support either side substantially. We were basically remote from that conflict, insofar as a great power like the United States can be remote, but we didn't really have a direct role in it. Has that led to bad feelings towards the United States? I'm sure there are some. There were tremendous conspiracy theories. I mean, basically, each side, the Iraqi and the Iranian, blamed the United States for the actions of the other side. How convincing that was, I can't exactly tell you, but conspiracy theories have a glorious role in the Middle East. They, you know, anything goes wrong, you know, there will be a conspiracy theory. For example, just a couple of days ago, a ferry boat went down with over 1,000 deaths in Egypt. I would be shocked if there were not conspiracy theories about how the United States or Israel or somebody rather, Britain, was behind those deaths. They're totally wrong, but they're, as I say, they're virulent, and they distort the way many Middle Easterners understand current events.
Daniel Pipes, as we talk about democracy and the Middle East, things like press freedom, sensibilities, what's your perspective on all these stories about the cartoons being published in Europe and the reaction? Here's one of the latest photos of a Danish flag being burned in Baghdad. Yesterday it was Damascus. Today it's Beirut. What do you think?
Well, I was hoping you asked, because I'm the author of a book about the Rushdie Affair of 1989. Called the Rushdie Affair. And this has very strong echoes of that, in that it is the Muslim world telling the West, you may not criticize or mock our sanctities, the Prophet and other aspects of our religion. And the West saying, yes, we may. We mock our own religions, we can mock yours. Get used to it. And the Muslims saying, no, we're not going to get used to it. This is absolutely unacceptable. This is not this is an extraordinarily clear representation of the differences between the West and the Muslim world, though I must say that there are plenty of Westerners who are sympathetic to the Muslim point of view, and there are plenty of Muslims who decry the Muslim attitude and are sympathetic to the West. I think the key here is that we in the West maintain solidarity with Denmark and stand by it. I was very disappointed to see the State Department's statements, even more disappointed to see the British statements, just pushing this whole question away, and in the British case, even condemning the publication of the cartoons. We have the right to blaspheme, to mock, to satirize, to criticize, and those who don't like it have the perfect right to protest, to economically boycott, to make their feelings known. But bringing in the hard edge of violence, as was the case with Ayatollah Khomeini and his death edict on Salman Rushdie back in 1989, and is the case now with the burning of the Danish and other embassies in Syria and Lebanon, who knows what other violence is to come. This is utterly, utterly unacceptable. The Muslim world needs to understand that we have certain ways, and we need to understand that they don't like it, but they don't have the right to engage in violence, and we need to make that very clear, that this is unacceptable.
Toledo, Ohio, you're on now with Daniel Pipes. Hello there.
Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I have two questions. One is, do you know why Iraq chose the parliamentarian model for government over the American system, where the parliamentary system, one faction has almost all the power, whereas in the American system, factions have to share power?
Let me stop you there. We'll get your second question in a sec. Let's get an answer first from Mr. Pipes. Go ahead, sir.
The American model, however well it works for us in the United States, is actually very rare. I'm racking my brain. I can't really think of any other country where it exists, where we have where a two-party system exists, where, as you point out, all the differences are within the parties, rather than having a fractured political scene with lots of parties. The parliamentary system is nearly universal, so it's what exists in the region, it's what exists nearly everywhere. It is the natural thing for the Iraqis to adopt. It is, by the way, a system that we have sponsored in many other countries, where we have liberated the countries. For example, post-World War II.
Second question, caller?
Go
ahead.
Do you think that Iraq is going to be able to hold it together, the Kurds, the Shiites, and the Sunnis? Do you think they'll be able to hold it together? Or do you think this parliamentary system will give the Shiites all the power that will influence the Sunnis and the Kurds to secede?
Thank you.
Well, as one wit put it some weeks ago when the elections took place, this was less an election than a census. That is to say, each of the major groups, Kurds, Sunnis, Shiites, voted for theirs. It's a very communal kind of politics. This has real dangers. Ideally, politics is about policies, not about personnel. That said, the pressure on the Iraqis to work together, not to fall apart, not to have a separate Kurdistan, for example, is very strong. And although many Kurds would like to go their own way and leave the Iraqi polity, I don't think it's likely. And I don't know that it would be good for the region or for ourselves if they did. Iraq is unwieldy. Iraq is got a sad history over its existence. But I would be more inclined to try and fix it than to see it fall apart, in part because were Iraq to fall apart, then other countries might follow it, beginning a process that would lead to a great deal of violence and turmoil. So, although the existing borders are far from ideal, they're probably better than a total rethinking of the map, starting with Iraq.
Pittsburgh, you're on the air.
Yes, first of all, thank you for taking my call. And I'd like to ask you what you think about fighting this war primarily via covert means. And by that I mean when leaders of countries preach what they're preaching, like the leader of Iran, or mullahs preach hatred and death to America, about literally going in and assassinating them or taking them out by covert means. Do you think this would spark a wider war, or do you think in the end this is our best bet?
Daniel Pipes.
Would it be to our advantage to use more covert means than overt means? I think in certain cases, yes. Not quite sure. You have to think it all through very carefully, but I don't think a general ban on covert means is a good idea. We do use covert means. There is a ban on the assassination of foreign leaders. It's been in place for some 30 years. I do think we should keep all our options on the table.
Last call here for Campbell, Kentucky. Welcome.
Hello. You can go to the NoWarForIsrael.com website. Daniel Pipes is an ardent Zionist Jew who's trying to get us to bomb Iran for Israel. Why don't you come clean with your pro-Israel Likud view, Mr. Pipes? You basically talk about freedom of speech, yet you don't agree with college professors who speak out against Israel. That's what your whole campus watch organization's about. And if you talk about freedom of speech, what about David Irving? I don't necessarily agree with his views, but he's facing 20 years in Europe because of Zionist Jews like you that are trying to shut him up from basically historically looking at the Holocaust.
Daniel Pipes.
I'm not going to dignify this coarse, vulgar attack on me with any kind of answer at all.
Back to something you said earlier. You said democracy should proceed slowly, modestly, carefully in that part of the world. How do you do that in this post-9/11 world where there are threats or perceived threats, and how do you expect a future U.S. administration to handle this?
Well, again, I endorse the goal of democracy. I just think it's going to take, in the Middle East as it has in Eastern Europe or East Asia or Latin America, a long time to make it work and make it a full process. And so I urge our government to go slow in the implementation of it, to emphasize the development of private property law and rule of law and freedom of speech, and then finally get to elections, legislative and executive branch, but to understand that this is a long-term process as opposed to doing it so quickly as we're doing at present. And I think we can achieve great things that way, but more modestly, more cautiously, more slowly.
Daniel Pipes is director of the Middle East Forum, joining us from New York this morning. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
We will take a brief time out and speak further about U.S.-Iranian relations. Our guests will be Jerome Corsi, author of Atomic Iran. He'll be in New York as well. Also Michael Shedlock of Global Economic Analysis.blogspot.com joining us from Chicago. And more of your calls. Be right back.